Winter storms in Montana aren't anything new. If you live here long enough, you get used to the snow, the isolation, the way the wind howls through the trees at night like some unseen thing calling out from the dark. You learn to handle the loneliness, the biting cold, and the knowledge that out here, you're on your own. I've been living alone in my cabin on the outskirts of Pine Hollow for the past 5 years. It's a modest place, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom structure with a wood stove, old furniture, and a view of the endless pine forest stretching beyond my backyard. It's far enough from town to be peaceful, but close enough that I can drive in for supplies when needed. I don't mind the solitude. Hell, after my wife passed, I welcomed it. But that winter, late December, right before Christmas, the storm that rolled in was unlike anything I'd seen before. It hit fast, thick walls of snow swallowing the landscape, the wind screaming through the trees like it wanted to tear them from the ground. By the time I got home that evening, the roads were already becoming impassable. I barely managed to get my truck into the driveway before the drift swallowed it whole. After a quick round of shoveling, just enough to get to my front door, I stepped inside, locking up behind me and turning up the heat. The house groaned in protest against the storm, but I didn't mind the sound. I found it comforting in a way, like the walls were reminding me they'd keep me safe. I made myself a mug of coffee, settled into my recliner, and turned on the TV, ready to wait out the storm in peace. I must have dozed off, the flickering light from the screen casting eerie shadows along the walls. When I woke up, the clock read just past midnight. The wind outside had only grown stronger, rattling the windows and shaking the old wooden beams of the cabin. And then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 sharp raps against the front door. I sat up, heart already picking up speed. No one came out here. My nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and no one in their right mind would be traveling in this weather. I hesitated, listening, hoping maybe I'd imagined it. Knock, knock, knock. It came again, clearer this time. Someone was out there. I stood, making my way slowly to the window beside the door, lifting the curtain just enough to peer outside. The porch light cast a dim, hazy glow over the snow-covered steps, and at first I saw nothing, just the swirling white of the blizzard. But then I noticed them. Boot prints. A clear set of tracks in the untouched snow leading straight up to my door and back down the steps. But no one was there. A deep unease settled in my chest. Maybe someone had gotten lost and stumbled upon my place. But why knock and then leave? And how had they vanished so quickly in the middle of a blizzard? I wasn't about to open the door to find out. Instead, I double-checked the lock, grabbed the old hunting rifle I kept by the fireplace, and sat back down, listening. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The wind continued to scream, the snow kept falling, and slowly I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe the storm had played tricks on my ears, or maybe... But this time it wasn't at the front door. It came from the side of the house, near the kitchen window. I moved quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I flicked off the lights, grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door, and stepped carefully toward the kitchen. The window was coated in a thick layer of frost, making it impossible to see out. I pressed my ear against the glass. Silence. Swallowing hard, I turned off the flashlight and aimed it outside. The snow beneath the window was untouched, no footprints, no signs of anyone having stood there. But I had heard the knock. I stood there for a long time, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other, scanning the darkness outside. The thought of someone or something lurking just beyond my sight made my skin crawl. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a branch, or maybe even the storm shifting the house. I turned the lights back on, locked every window, and headed to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand. I barely slept. Sometime in the early morning hours, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. Knock. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the back of the house. I sat up, the pit in my stomach turning ice cold. Slowly, I crept down the hallway toward the sliding glass door that led to the back deck. The curtain wasn't drawn, and beyond the glass, the snow-covered deck was empty. No footprints, no tracks leading up to the door, but the knocks had been real. I stood there, staring out into the night, breath fogging up the glass. The only thing visible was the faint outline of the trees at the edge of my property, their dark forms swaying against the storm. Then, just for a second, I swore I saw something move between them. A figure, tall, still, watching. I backed away, heart hammering, locked the sliding door, and retreated to the living room. The knocks didn't stop. Every hour, like clockwork, they moved around the house. Front door, side window, back deck. Sometimes louder, sometimes softer. By morning, the storm had eased, and sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds. I stepped outside, bundled in my thickest coat, rifle slung over my shoulder. The air was deathly still, the snow deep and untouched in some areas. But as I walked around the house, I saw them, footprints, circling my home, stopping at every window, every entrance. But they didn't just stop at the house. They continued deep into the woods, and when I followed them, they led me to something else. Snowmobile tracks. I crouched, examining them closely. They weren't fresh, covered in a thin layer of snow. Whoever had been outside my home had left just before dawn, knowing the snowfall would cover their escape. I didn't follow. Instead, I turned back, went inside, and locked every door. That afternoon, I drove into town, 20 miles through the ice and slush to the nearest gun store. I left with a shotgun, a box of shells, and a firm resolution. I had always loved the solitude of my cabin, the quiet, the peace. But now, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I find myself glancing at the windows, checking the locks, because I know whoever was out there that night, they might come back, and next time, I'll be ready. After the footsteps, the snowmobile tracks, and the endless knocking, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been testing me, circling like a predator around prey. The shotgun by my side became a constant companion. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. But I wasn't the only one haunted by the winter. A few weeks after my own encounter, I heard a story from a buddy of mine, Mike, who works down at the feed store in town. He told me about a guy who'd come through Pine Hollow not long ago, pale as a ghost, eyes hollowed out like he hadn't slept in weeks. The man didn't stay long, just filled up his tank and drove off, but not before telling Mike about something he'd experienced on a frozen lake up in Vermont. His name was Jake Patterson, and this was what happened to him. I don't mind the cold, never have. Growing up in Vermont, you get used to it. The long winters, the ice-covered roads, the endless snow. It becomes part of your life, like breathing. That's why ice fishing had always been a tradition for me, ever since I was a kid sitting beside my dad on frozen lakes while he sipped black coffee from a dented thermos and taught me the patience it took to catch a northern pike. I still remember the sound of the ice groaning beneath us, like some ancient creature stirring from its sleep. Dad always said it was nothing to worry about. Just the ice settling, adjusting to the weight. Turns out, sometimes the ice groans for a different reason. It was a Saturday morning when I decided to head up to Crystal Lake. The weather forecast predicted a snowstorm, but that didn't bother me. The ice was thick this time of year, solid enough to park a truck on. I packed my gear, filled the thermos with coffee, and hit the road. The drive took about 2 hours, the sky growing darker as I climbed into the mountains. By the time I reached the lake, the snow had started falling. Light at first, then heavier. The wind whispered through the trees lining the shore as I dragged my sled across the ice, the snow squeaking beneath my boots. The lake stretched out like a frozen wasteland, covered in a thick crust of ice. There were no other fishermen that day, just me. I found a spot near the center, drilled 2 holes, set up my portable shack, and turned on the propane heater. The warmth spread through the cramped space, and I settled into my folding chair, watching the tip-ups for movement. The snow hit harder now, tapping against the canvas walls. The rhythmic hum of the heater filled the air. Hours passed. The storm grew worse, turning the world outside into a swirling white void. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I saw something through the small, frost-rimmed window. A figure, standing about 30 yards away. The person wore a heavy coat and a hood pulled low over their face. I could see their breath misting in the air, though they didn't move, just stood there, facing my shack. I squinted, trying to make out any details. Maybe another fisherman who got lost in the storm? I stepped outside, my breath catching in my chest as the cold hit me like a sledgehammer. I raised a hand, waving. "Hey, you okay?" The figure didn't respond. I took a few steps closer, boots crunching against the ice. The wind howled around us, carrying flakes that stung against my cheeks. The person shifted slightly, lifting a gloved hand and pointing down. I followed the direction of the gesture. He was pointing at the ice beneath my feet. The surface looked fine, solid, thick, without cracks. I frowned and looked back at the figure. "What's wrong?" The figure's voice came, muffled by the wind, but sharp enough to cut through it. "It's not safe." The way he said it sent a spike of cold deeper than any winter chill. There was no urgency, no panic, just a flat, certain warning. I opened my mouth to respond, but a sharp crack echoed beneath me. The ice groaned. I took a step backward, my heart hammering. Another crack shot through the ice, branching like lightning beneath the snow-dusted surface. My breath caught in my throat as the groaning intensified. The figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the whiteout. Then the ice gave way. The ground beneath me split open with a deafening crack. The shack tilted violently, the heater inside tumbling as one side dropped into the black water. I dove backward, landing on my side, scrabbling like a trapped animal to escape the collapsing ice. My legs slid toward the hole as the water surged upward, slush spraying into the air. I found purchase, my gloved hands gripping an unbroken section of ice. With every ounce of strength, I pulled myself away from the hole, heart racing as the ice groaned in protest. My shack vanished into the water, along with my gear. The hole, now gaping and dark, swallowed it all. I didn't stop running until I reached the shore. Bent over, gasping for air, I turned back toward the lake. The surface was still shifting, fractures spreading like veins across the ice. Snow fell harder now, thick and unrelenting, but the figure was gone. When I finally made it back to town, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My mind raced, replaying the moment when the ice cracked beneath me, the figure pointing down with that eerie certainty. The next morning, after an almost sleepless night, I drove back to Crystal Lake. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape pristine and undisturbed. I stood at the shore and scanned the ice. The hole where my shack had gone under was visible, surrounded by jagged cracks. I expected to see footprints, mine and the stranger's, but aside from the shallow imprints I'd left when I fled, the ice was untouched. No tracks led to the spot where the figure had stood. No marks showed where they'd walked away. The surface, aside from the collapse near the shack, was smooth, undisturbed. It was as if they'd never been there at all. I asked around at the bait shop later that afternoon, mentioned what had happened. The owner, an older guy named Don, who'd been fishing these lakes for decades, gave me a strange look when I told him about the figure's warning. He reached behind the counter, grabbed an old weathered book, and flipped to a grainy black and white photo. It showed a man standing beside a sled of fish, smiling at the camera. The caption beneath read, "James Carter, 1963D. "That him?" Don asked. The resemblance wasn't exact, but the eyes, the hood, the build, close enough that my stomach twisted. "Who is he?" I asked. Don tapped the picture. "Local legend. Carter fell through the ice back in '63. They never found his body. Since then, some folks claim to see him during storms. Says he shows up when the ice turns treacherous." I tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak. "You really think I saw a ghost?" Don shrugged. "I think you're still breathing, aren't you?" Jake Patterson left Vermont soon after that. I don't know what haunted him more, the ice cracking beneath his feet or the figure that warned him. But when Mike told me the story, my mind went back to the footsteps circling my cabin, the snowmobile tracks vanishing into the woods, the unseen presence just beyond the windows. The unseen presence just beyond the windows. Winter has a way of hiding things. It muffles sounds, covers tracks, swallows secrets. But sometimes, the things hidden in the snow aren't gone. They're just waiting. Winter does strange things to people. It isolates you, makes you second guess what you hear, what you see, what you think you know. After what happened to me during that snowstorm, and after hearing Jake Patterson's story about the frozen guardian at Crystal Lake, I realized how easily the winter blurs the line between the ordinary and the impossible. But the next story I heard unsettled me more than any of the others. Her name was Sarah Miller. She wasn't the type to scare easily, an architect from Denver who loved solo trips to the mountains. She came through Pine Hollow once, a few months after her weekend at Whispering Pines Lodge, and told me her story over coffee at the diner. It wasn't just the fear in her eyes that stuck with me, it was the way she kept glancing at the windows, like she still expected someone to be watching. I've always loved snowstorms. Growing up in Colorado, winter was my favorite season. The mountains blanketed in white, the crisp, sharp air, the peaceful quiet that came when the snow muffled every sound. It felt like the world slowed down and everything became still. That's why I booked a cabin at Whispering Pines Lodge that February. I needed a break from the constant noise of city life. Honking horns, construction, endless meetings, just me, the snow, and silence. The cabin was exactly what I'd hoped for, rustic but comfortable, nestled in the woods about 30 miles from town. I arrived just as the snow started to fall, the road already slick with ice. The place looked like a postcard. The sickles hanging from the roof, smoke from the chimney curling into the cold sky. The key was waiting in a lockbox by the door, just like the rental company promised. The air inside was cold, but the wood stove lit easily, crackling warmth into the room. I unpacked, made a cup of hot cocoa, and settled in for a quiet night. But the first odd thing happened almost immediately. There were dirty dishes in the sink, 2 coffee mugs, a plate, and a frying pan streaked with old grease. I stood there for a minute, confused. The rental was supposed to have been clean after the last guests. I called the management company, but they brushed it off, saying the cleaners might have missed a few things. Annoying, but not alarming. I washed the dishes and moved on. Later, when I went into the bedroom to unpack, I noticed the bed. The blankets were rumpled, and the pillow had a distinct indentation. Curious, I pressed my hand against the mattress. It was warm. That was the first time I felt it, that prickle of unease down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the heating system had warmed the bed, maybe wearing walnuts to the bed, or maybe the previous guest had just left. Either way, I told myself it didn't matter. I was here now, and I was going to enjoy the weekend. By nightfall, the snowstorm had fully set in. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled on the couch with a book. The fire crackled, the wind whistled, and the sense of unease gradually faded, until I heard the footsteps. They came from the second floor, soft, steady creaks above me, like someone was walking across the bedroom. I froze, heart racing. The cabin only had one entrance, and I'd locked it. My eyes darted to the shadows beyond the fireplace. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something pale passing by the staircase. I grabbed the fire poker, my breath shallow, and forced myself to climb the stairs. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the draft. I pushed it open with the tip of the poker. The room was empty. The bed, which I'd straightened earlier, was rumpled again. The window was closed, but the frost on the glass was smeared, like someone had pressed their face against it from the inside. I searched the entire cabin after that. Under the beds, in the closets, even the tiny storage crawl space beneath the stairs. Nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined the footsteps. That night, I slept with the fire poker beside me. The next morning, the storm had eased. I brewed coffee and opened the curtains, trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. The snow outside was pristine in most places, except for one set of footprints leading away from the back door. Boot prints, large, fresh. I followed them with my eyes. They started at the door, circled the cabin, stopping beneath each window, then trailed off into the woods. I hadn't opened the back door. Gripping the poker tightly, I moved toward the door to check the lock. It was still bolted from the inside. My mind struggled to process it. No forced entry, no broken glass, and yet someone had been inside. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. 2 officers arrived about an hour later. Officer Riley, a younger guy who looked like he still believed in simple explanations, and Officer Grant, older and quieter. I explained everything, the dishes, the bed, the footsteps, the footprints. Riley gave me a skeptical smile. Probably just a squatter, ma'am. These cabins stay empty for weeks sometimes. Someone might have found a way in, got spooked when you showed up and left. Through a locked door? I asked, voice trembling. Grant didn't say anything. He just walked around the cabin, studying the windows. Finally, he knelt by the footprints outside and frowned. These tracks go into the woods, he said. Yeah, I whispered. Can you follow them? He didn't answer right away. He rose, hand resting on his belt, and exchanged a glance with Riley. They don't just go into the woods. They go to the old well. I blinked. The well? Grant nodded. About 50 yards into the forest. It was boarded up years ago. Local legend says the original caretaker of this lodge disappeared out there. No one's touched it in decades. Riley laughed nervously. Come on, Grant, don't spook her with ghost stories. But Grant's eyes stayed on mine. We'll check it out, he said. They followed the tracks into the woods while I stood in the doorway, clutching the fire poker. The snow muffled their footsteps until I could no longer see or hear them. Minutes passed. Finally, they returned. Boards on the well are gone, Grant said. Footprints lead right up to the edge. No prints leading away. I stared at him. Someone climbed into the well? Grant's jaw tightened. Looks like it. I spent the next hour throwing my things into my suitcase. Officer Grant waited in the living room while I packed. When I left, he walked me to my car and shut the door behind me. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, watching the cabin. That night, safe in my apartment back in Denver, I tried to convince myself it was over. But when I woke up the next morning, the frost on my bedroom window was smeared in the same pattern I'd seen at the cabin, and in the corner of the glass, someone had written 2 words with their fingertip. Found you. Sarah never went back to Whispering Pines Lodge. I can't say I blame her. Because winter does strange things to people, and sometimes, when you think you're alone, you're not. When Sarah finished telling me her story about the footprints, the well, and that message written in frost, I couldn't shake the chill it left behind. Found you. The words stuck with me, looping in my mind long after she'd left the diner. I wish I could say these winter encounters were rare, that these stories were just tales passed around small towns to keep things interesting during the long cold months, but I've learned that winter hides more than just ice beneath its surface. Like the story David Thompson told me one bitter January night, sitting across from me in the same booth where Sarah had once shared hers. David was a wildlife photographer from Wyoming. His job had taken him to some of the most remote places in the country, but what happened to him one winter while chasing a snowstorm in Wolf Creek Pass made him reconsider venturing out alone ever again. I've always chased storms. Most people hunker down when the weather gets rough. Board up windows, crank the heat, and stay put. Not me. I've spent decades photographing wildlife in extreme conditions, capturing the raw, unforgiving beauty of nature at its worst. Wolves prowling across frozen rivers, elk pushing through waist-high drifts. I knew how to respect the cold, but I never feared it. Until that night on Wolf Creek Pass. It was mid-March when the forecast warned of a snowstorm sweeping down from Canada. Perfect conditions for some dramatic shots. I packed my gear, loaded up my old Jeep Cherokee, and headed for the pass, climbing into the mountains as thick gray clouds gathered overhead. By the time I reached the viewpoint around 4 p.m., the first flakes were falling. The world turned white fast. Within an hour, the road disappeared beneath a blanket of snow, and the temperature plummeted. I parked at a pull-off near mile marker 76, set up my tripod, and started shooting. The wind cut like a blade, whistling through the trees, but I caught some incredible images. Misty mountains cloaked in snow, pine trees bowing under ice. The storm hit harder around dusk. The wind intensified, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. I decided to call it a night and head back down the mountain. But when I tried to turn around, my tires spun uselessly in the snow. I was stuck. No big deal. I had supplies. A sleeping bag, snacks, water. If I needed to, I could wait until morning. I climbed into the driver's seat, cranked the heater, and let the engine run while the snow continued to pile up outside. By 9 p.m., the storm had turned the world into a swirling white void. The headlights illuminated nothing but a wall of snow. The radio crackled with weather updates, warning travelers to stay off the roads. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and tried to get some sleep. That's when the headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. Two glowing orbs cut through the storm from somewhere behind me. A vehicle, maybe 50 yards back, its lights bright but distorted by the snow. Relief flooded me. Maybe it was a plow or another traveler. I sat up, watching the lights, but they didn't move closer. They just hovered there. I turned on my hazard lights, flashed my brights twice. The other vehicle didn't respond. It just sat there, engine idling. I opened my window a crack and listened. Through the wind, I heard the faint rumble of an engine, low, steady, like a diesel truck. Maybe they were stuck too, or maybe they were just being cautious. I reached for my phone to call for help, but of course, no service, not up here. I glanced at the lights again. They were closer now, maybe 30 yards back, and still, the vehicle didn't move, just crept forward like a predator closing in. The hair on my arms stood up. Something about the way they moved, slow, deliberate, made my gut clench. I locked my doors. The light stayed put for another 5 minutes. Then the vehicle shifted. It began to circle me. The truck swung to the left, tires crunching through the snow. Its high beams passed across my windshield as it moved around my Jeep. Through the glare, I caught a glimpse of the driver's silhouette, a figure bundled in a heavy coat and hat, their face hidden in shadow. The truck completed a full circle around me, then stopped directly in front of my car, facing me. The headlights drilled into my eyes. I stared back, my mouth dry. The truck's engine revved, once, twice, a deep, guttural sound like a growl. I kept my hands on the wheel, breathing shallowly. I couldn't make out the make or model of the truck, just an old boxy shape with a dark, weathered grille and fogged-out headlights. The driver didn't move, didn't open the door, just sat there, watching me. And then the truck reversed. It backed up slowly, headlights dipping with each bump in the snow, returning to its original position behind me. The lights shut off. Darkness swallowed the road. I strained my eyes, trying to see if the truck was still there. The snow made everything a blur. The only light came from my headlights and the faint glow of the dashboard. Then, I heard it. Footsteps, crisp, deliberate crunches in the snow. They moved from behind the Jeep to the driver's side. I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. A figure stood just outside my window. A figure stood just outside my window. The glass had fogged from the heater, but I could make out the shape of a man. His breath fogged the window as he leaned close. His gloved hand tapped against the glass. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I could just make out the lower half of his face, skin pale against the darkness, lips stretched into a faint, crooked smile. He didn't say anything, just stood there, smiling. My hand fumbled for the gear shift. I slammed it into reverse, tires spinning. The Jeep jolted backward, tires skidding across the ice. The figure stepped back into the shadows. I twisted the wheel, throwing the Jeep into drive and pressing the gas. The tires caught. I lurched forward, swerving past the truck and speeding down the snow-covered road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the diner, 20 miles down the mountain. I parked directly beneath the streetlight and ran inside, breathless and shaking. The waitress on duty was a middle-aged woman named Fran. When I told her what had happened, her face went pale. "That truck," she said softly. "Was it an old blue Ford? Rust along the sides?" I nodded, heart sinking. "Yeah." "How did you—" "We've had reports," she said, eyes flicking toward the window. "That truck's been seen near stalled cars during storms. Drivers go missing. We found one guy's car last winter, abandoned on the pass. No sign of him, just footprints circling the car over and over." I gripped my coffee cup, feeling the ceramic tremble beneath my fingers. "Did you ever find him?" "No." She hesitated, then added, "But someone left a message on his windshield." The diner felt deathly cold despite the heater blasting. "What did it say?" I whispered. She didn't answer right away. She just turned toward the window, eyes scanning the parking lot like she expected to see headlights materializing from the storm. Finally she said, "See you next storm." David stopped speaking then, eyes haunted. That night, I double-checked the locks on my cabin twice, and when the wind started to howl through the trees, I swore I heard the faint rumble of an engine out in the distance. Winter doesn't just chill your skin, it finds its way into your bones, into your mind. I learned that the hard way after the knocks on my cabin, after Jake's warning on Crystal Lake, after Sarah's intruder at Whispering Pines, and David's encounter with the circling truck in Wolf Creek Pass. And just when I thought these winter tales couldn't get any worse, I met Rachel Davis. She walked into Pine Hollow one frigid evening in February, snow clinging to her hair and eyes shadowed with exhaustion. We ended up sitting across from each other in the diner, me nursing black coffee, her gripping a mug with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Rachel was a ghost hunter, or at least that's what she called herself, but she didn't look like someone who chased shadows for fun. No excitement, just fear. The story she told me that night still makes me check my windows whenever it snows. Ghost hunting started as a hobby, something fun, you know how it goes. A few creepy stories, a few nights in old houses with EMF detectors and cheap night vision cameras. We didn't expect to find much, just cold spots and weird noises to share online. People eat that stuff up. But after a year of chasing whispers, we found Frosthaven Asylum. The place was legendary in Michigan ghost hunting circles. Built in 1921, shut down in the 70s, left to rot ever since. Officially, they closed it because of structural concerns. Unofficially, people said patients vanished there. Staff would report seeing shadowy figures roaming the halls. And then there was Evelyn Moore. She was a patient, admitted for schizophrenia. According to old records, she claimed voices in the snow spoke to her. One winter night, in 1964, she disappeared without a trace. The only thing they found was a frost-covered window in her locked room with the words, "Stay with me," etched into the ice. I should have left the story alone. But the first snowstorm of the season rolled in last December, and I couldn't resist. I packed my gear, told my boyfriend Jason I'd be gone overnight, and drove 2 hours to Frosthaven. The asylum sat at the end of an old service road, hidden behind frost-coated trees. The building was 3 stories of crumbling brick, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the woods. Snow piled against the entrance, untouched by human steps. I parked, grabbed my backpack and flashlight and crunched through the snow to the entrance. The front doors were boarded up, but a broken window near the west wing gave me access. I crawled through, landing on cold, dusty tiles. The air inside was sharp and stale. My breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight. The silence felt wrong. I shook off the unease and got to work. Set up my camera in the main corridor. Asked the usual questions. "Is anyone here with me? Can you give me a sign?" Nothing, just the wind, groaning through the walls. I wandered through the halls, passing rooms with rusted bed frames and peeling wallpaper. When I reached the old patient wing, I saw the name, E. Moore, etched into a tarnished brass plaque outside room 2017. My heart skipped. Evelyn's room. The door creaked open when I pushed it. The room was empty, except for a metal bed frame bolted to the floor and a single window. Frost had spread across the glass in swirling patterns. I stepped closer and snapped a picture. That's when I heard the footsteps. Soft. Shuffling. Coming from the hallway. I swung my flashlight toward the door. The corridor was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They moved past the door and around the corner toward the stairwell. My pulse spiked. I knew I should leave, but I followed. The stairs groaned under my weight. The footsteps stayed just ahead of me, leading upward. On the 3rd floor, the sound stopped. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with locked doors. At the end of the hall, someone stood by the window. A woman. She wore a thin hospital gown, hair matted to her skull. Her skin looked gray, her feet bare on the icy floor. "Hello?" I called out. My voice trembled. She didn't move, didn't even turn around. just stood there, staring at the frost-covered window. I forced myself forward, 10 feet, 5, close enough to see the ragged scratches on her arms. "Are you Evelyn?" I whispered. Her head tilted slightly, not toward me, toward the window. I followed her gaze. The frost on the glass shifted before my eyes, forming letters as if an invisible fingertip were writing from the other side. "Stay with me." The woman turned her head then, slowly, revealing a face that shouldn't have been possible. It was me. My own eyes, my own mouth. Except her lips stretched wider, splitting the skin at the corners. Her eyes stared through me, empty and endless. I staggered backward. She lunged. The flashlight fell from my hand. I scrambled for the stairs, slipping on the frozen floor. Behind me, footsteps pounded, closing the distance. I reached the stairs and half fell down the steps. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I dared a glance upward. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching. Her head tilted, and then she smiled again, mouth unnaturally wide. Then she whispered, "The snow will find you." The words slithered through the air, sharp as the cold. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my hands shredded from climbing through the broken window. I jumped into my car and tore down the snowy road without looking back. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The following morning I checked my camera footage. Most of it was static, but one clip stood out. In it, I stood in Evelyn's room, asking questions. But when I turned away from the window, a second figure appeared behind me. The woman. She whispered something. I cranked the volume and played it again. "Stay with me." Rachel's eyes glistened as she finished her story. "I moved 2 weeks later," she said, voice hollow. "But it doesn't matter. The frost finds me anyway. Every time it snows, I wake up to see the window in my bedroom smeared like someone's been standing outside, watching me. Sometimes there's writing." "What does it say?" I asked, though I already knew. She swallowed hard. "The snow will find you." That night, after Rachel left, I sat alone in my cabin, the fire crackling in the wood stove. The storm outside had grown heavier, snow swirling past the windows. I forced myself to look toward the glass. Frost webbed the corners like skeletal fingers, and there, just above my reflection, a message had appeared in the ice. "The snow will find you." I didn't sleep the night after Rachel left. Her story stayed with me. The frost-pritten words, the figure that mirrored her face, and the warning, "The snow will find you." Winter wasn't just a season in these stories. It was something else, a veil through which things moved. People, ghosts, predators. I sat by the window until sunrise, shotgun across my lap, watching the snow pile against the glass like a suffocating hand. I thought maybe that was the end of it. 4 stories were enough to make anyone paranoid, but fear has a way of spreading, like frost creeping across a window pane. And a few nights later, the phone rang. His name was Kyle Roberts. He was a trucker passing through Raven Ridge, Idaho, and he had a story of his own, a story that tied everything together in a way I wish it hadn't. Driving a semi through the Rockies in winter isn't for the faint-hearted. The wind cuts across the roads like a razor, ice forms in the blink of an eye, and visibility can vanish in seconds. But I'd been doing it for nearly a decade, hauling freight between Spokane and Salt Lake City. I knew the roads, the weather patterns, the dangers. I thought I knew everything. That night in late January, I was making good time on Route 89. The snowstorm had hit earlier than expected, thick flakes swirling like ash in my high beams. The wind pushed against the rig, making the trailer shudder. I slowed down, shifted into low gear, and kept going. The road climbed through Raven Ridge, a desolate stretch of highway bordered by endless pine forests. Not a single other vehicle in sight. The silence was absolute except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crack of ice beneath the tires. I had just passed a green mile marker when I saw her. A woman stood on the shoulder, illuminated by my headlights. She wore a long, tattered coat and no hat. Her hair hung in wet clumps, her skin almost as pale as the snow around her. She waved one arm as I approached, her face turning toward the truck. Something about her expression, it wasn't relief, it was fear. I slowed and pulled over, my tires crunching into the snowbank. Truckers help people stuck in storms. It's an unwritten rule. I reached for my phone to call the state patrol, but saw the no service icon glowing mockingly. Typical for these mountains. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The woman stood motionless a few feet away, her breath coming in short, sharp clouds. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted to the forest behind her. "Ma'am, you okay?" I asked. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "He's following me." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I turned my flashlight toward the woods. The beam cut through the snow, revealing only tree trunks and swirling white. "Who's following you?" I asked, my voice lower now. She didn't answer, just wrapped her arms around herself and glanced at the passenger side of my truck. I got the message. "Okay, let's get you warm." I opened the door, helped her climb in, and shut it firmly. Then I circled back to the driver's side, scanning the woods again before getting in. Inside, the heater blasted warm air, fogging the windows. The woman sat stiffly, hands in her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead. Her coat was threadbare and damp. "Name's Kyle," I said, forcing some normalcy into my voice. "What about you?" She didn't respond. "Where were you headed?" I tried again. Still nothing. I checked the rearview mirror out of habit, and my stomach dropped. Headlights. Far back on the road, two pale lights shimmered through the snow. "That him?" I asked softly. The woman didn't move, but her breathing quickened. The truck behind us sped up. The headlights grew larger, brighter. I tapped the brakes. The other vehicle matched my speed. I accelerated. So did the lights. "What the hell?" I muttered, gripping the wheel. The woman finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the engine. "Don't let him catch us." The truck behind us closed the distance, headlights glaring in the mirrors. My rig's engine roared as I pushed the accelerator, tires skidding on icy patches. The pursuing vehicle swerved left, then right, weaving across the road. The woman whimpered and turned her head toward the side mirror. Her eyes reflected the glow of the headlights like a cornered animal's. The road ahead twisted into a downhill curve, bordered by a sheer drop on one side and dense forest on the other. I downshifted and held the wheel tight, forcing myself to breathe. The pursuing truck, a battered old Ford from what I could tell, lurched closer. I could see the driver now, a shadowy figure gripping the wheel with one hand, the other resting casually on the open window's edge. As we reached the curve, the Ford accelerated, veering toward my trailer's rear end. "He's trying to jackknife us," I hissed. The woman clutched the dashboard. "Don't stop!" The Ford slammed into the trailer with a metallic crunch. My rig shuddered, fishtailing slightly. I wrestled with the steering wheel, trying to keep us on the road. In the mirror, I saw the driver's face for the first time. His skin was unnaturally pale, his lips stretched into a grin too wide for his face. His eyes were empty black voids. Another impact jolted the trailer. My tires skidded toward the guardrail. I made a split-second decision. I jerked the wheel right, heading toward the forest's edge instead of the cliff. The truck crashed through the snowbank and slammed into the trees, the airbag exploding into my chest. Metal groaned, glass shattered, snow poured through the broken windshield. The engine sputtered and died. Silence. The woman was gone. The passenger door hung open, snow swirling into the cab. I scrambled out, heart racing. Footprints led away from the truck into the woods, smaller prints alongside larger ones. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the tracks. They wound between trees, heading deeper into the forest. The wind howled, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound. Footsteps behind me. I turned the flashlight around. Nothing. I swung the beam ahead again. The footprints stopped abruptly. And then I heard it. Slow breathing. Close. The flashlight flickered. I banged it with my palm. The beam steadied and illuminated a figure standing just ahead. The woman. She faced me now, coat hanging open, eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved without sound. Then she raised one trembling hand and pointed behind me. I didn't want to turn, but I did. The man stood a few feet away. The same pale skin, the same stretched grin. His eyes gleamed like wet stones beneath the hood of his coat. He tilted his head and stepped forward. I swung the flashlight at him. The beam passed through his body like mist. The cold around me intensified, stabbing through my coat and into my chest. My breath faltered. The figure leaned closer, his smile widening as he whispered, "The snow will find you." I don't remember running, just the feel of ice beneath my feet, tree branches tearing at my clothes, and the endless, suffocating cold. A snowplow driver found me the next morning, stumbling along the highway. Frostbitten and incoherent, Kyle sat across from me, his hands shaking as he finished his story. "The woman?" I asked. "They never found her," he said, voice hollow. "Just footprints in the snow, mine and his." That night, after Kyle left, I locked every door, every window. I sat by the fire until the flames died down, then glanced at the window. A handprint marked the frost-covered glass, and beneath it the words, "The snow has found you." If you're still watching this, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Enigma of the Unknown for more true, terrifying winter tales. Stay warm, stay alert, and if you hear footsteps in the snow, don't open the door. Winter, in all its beauty, holds a dangerous secret. Beneath the snow's soft surface lies a silent thread, one that doesn't just come from the cold or the ice. It comes from what hides within it. As I shared these 6 chilling stories, I couldn't help but reflect on what winter truly represents. Isolation, vulnerability, a quiet stillness that can lull us into a false sense of security. But as Ethan, Jake, Sarah, David, Rachel, and Kyle discovered, the snow isn't always a passive observer. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it warns, and sometimes it hunts. What can we learn from their terrifying encounters? First, never underestimate isolation. Out in the woods, by the lake, or on a deserted mountain pass, you're more vulnerable than you think. Lock your doors, stay aware of your surroundings, and if something feels off, trust that instinct. Ethan ignored the first knock but learned the hard way that curiosity can be dangerous when shadows circle your home. Second, respect nature's warnings. Jake's encounter on the ice reminds us that when nature groans, cracks, or shifts beneath our feet, we should listen. The unknown man who appeared to him wasn't just a ghost, he was a guardian. If you sense danger, don't rationalize it away, take it seriously. Third, never assume you're truly alone. Sarah walked into that cabin expecting solitude, but discovered she had company from the start. Predators, whether human or supernatural, often blend into the quiet corners of our lives. If you hear unfamiliar noises in a place that should be silent, investigate with caution, and never stay out of stubbornness. Fourth, trust your instincts around strangers. David knew something was off about that truck and the man circling his car. Strangers who appear too conveniently in isolated areas, especially during a storm, might not have good intentions. If your gut tells you to lock the doors and wait it out, listen to it. Fifth, some places hold memories that refuse to fade. Rachel learned this when the asylum whispered her name through frost-rimmed walls. Haunted locations carry more than just history. They carry echoes. If you go seeking them, prepare for what might seek you in return. And finally, not everything can be explained. Kyle never figured out who or what followed him that night. The snow swallows tracks, muffles sounds, and hides secrets. Some dangers aren't just physical, they live in the spaces where fear and the unknown intersect. So as winter approaches, stay cautious, enjoy the snow, but respect its quiet power. If you hear footsteps when no one should be there, or see a shadow just beyond the trees, trust your instincts. Winter is more than cold air and frozen ground. It's a veil, and sometimes things cross through it to find us. Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to these chilling tales. If you enjoyed the stories, please like, comment, and subscribe to Enigma of the Unknown for more haunting narratives. Your support means everything to me. It helps us continue bringing you the kind of stories that make you think twice before stepping into the snow. Stay warm, stay alert, and remember, the snow sees everything.